a very important point that you've raised at several points. You talked about this with regard to Yugoslavia, North Korea, to China, that we have to talk, that there are regimes out there that have, they can influence, they have power, they can affect the board, as it were, and not talking to them is not an option if there are other things at stake. You know, we don't want North Korea to use nuclear weapons. China is simply too big of a country in the international system. We can't, you know, ever hope to isolate it. And I think that in the past, it does seem that we kind of were able to square that circle. I think, as you had noted, that 20 years ago, the narrative is that China is liberalizing, so that they're going to move closer to where we are on certain issues of values, of governance, of human rights, and therefore that justifies the engagement. Whereas now it does seem that China has drawn some very clear lines saying we are, not the term they're going to use, but from our perspective, that they are committed to an illiberal form of governance, and that they're not going to continue moving in a direction that we would like. How, for a diplomat who has a mandate to get certain concrete things accomplished, we don't want conflict in the South China Sea, we want to ensure smooth running at the United Nations, where both China and the United States are veto-wielding powers. We want to make sure that the global commons remain open. At what point do the values questions, say, of human rights, how do they get assigned and ranked when you are engaged in talks across the table, and when you're engaged with talks, and thinking in the case of the North Koreans, where you are dealing with people that metaphorically or even literally may in fact have quote unquote blood on their hands for things that they've done, yet we still need to deal with them. Can you give us a sense of what it's like as a diplomat to have to navigate dealing with governments and representatives where on the one hand you'd like to say, I don't want to give you the time of day, but on the other hand, if I don't talk to you, there are worse outcomes, which in terms will have worse outcomes for values. You know, it will risk war or some great catastrophe. So how have you been able to reconcile that or deal with that in your own career, and any advice moving forward for people that have to kind of to grapple with that that question?
Well, as your question implies, it is very difficult. I mean, there is a point at which you don't talk to people. I think the U.S. was entirely correct not to talk to Nazi Germany. I mean, I think there's just a point at which you got to stop. So the question, or not start, the question is, of course, where do you get to that point? I think a key issue is, what do you think you can accomplish from the talks? Can you make something better? In making something better, can you also affect the situation of human rights? I think often you can. I have been in discussions. Again, I don't want to draw analogies between Slobodan Milosevic and the Chinese. I think it's kind of unfair to the Chinese. But you know, there were times when if you can't change an overall system, you can change that system for a few people. You can spring people from prison. You can make sure that when you talk to these regimes, you do not lose track of these issues of ethics and human rights, and they have a role in how you approach things. Now, with North Korea, my own view, I remember, not to quote one of my Russian counterparts, but he said, "You Americans, you don't think this is hard enough, and now you're going to be talking about human rights? You don't think it's already hard enough on the nuclear side?" He had a point, but I think I had a point too, and I told my North Korean counterpart, we are prepared in the context of a denuclearizing North Korea to pursue a normal relationship with North Korea in the context of denuclearizing, not a North Korea that doesn't denuclearize. We pursue a normal relationship and stand around and wait for them to do the right thing. These are all sort of action for action. You do this, we do this. But then I told them that when we get to the point of establishing any kind of relationship, we are going to have to, and I said have to because it's part of our value system, we're going to have to pursue the issue of human rights. I know you don't want to hear that, but what we would do is have a track in the context of any normalization with North Korea to kind of measure where we are on human rights and what can be done to improve it. Now, as I said, you often start by saying, can we spring these people from prison? Can we do this? It's got to be very incremental. And I think the problem with human rights abusers is they believe that this type of roughness with their own public is how they hold on to power. So it's very tough to get them to stop that because they feel that they're going to not be able to hold on to power the minute they stop that. So what you try to do is get a few things done. And what you don't do is try to humiliate them publicly. I'll give you another example with China. North Koreans would escape into China, sometimes with amazing journeys, but they somehow made it into China. And they sometimes made it into China with the great help of private groups. And, I am all in favor of that. What I'm not in favor of the private group is that the private group drops the refugee family at an American installation and then has a press conference to the effect that they have succeeded in getting these North Koreans into an American diplomatic establishment. And by the way, send us more money and we'll do this again. I think this is, when you're talking about people's lives and it's individuals' lives, you need to be very careful how you do that. And you need to be very careful not to use individuals in the pursuit of, your own goals. In the case of North Koreans who ended up in U.S. hands in China, sleeping in the basement of our consulate somewhere, I found it very useful, especially if we could keep it out of the public eye, to go to the Chinese and figure out how we could get them out. I found it very useful to have a good relationship with the South Koreans and an understanding that we were doing as much for that relationship as we could, and therefore they would do as much for us as they could. And people who think that diplomacy is just about individual transactions kind of miss the point of a broader approach. I was talking to I served in Macedonia at one point. I was talking to the Macedonian prime minister, and the issue was Albanian language in Albanian majority villages. And could they learn Albanian in the schools rather than the language Macedonia, which was the majority language, but not in these Albanian dominated towns. And I remember the prime minister said to me, this is very hard for me. This is very hard. You have no idea the opposition I get in Parliament when I suggest going along with this, with these types of issues. But then he said to me, but I value the relationship with the U.S. I know that my country's future is tied to our ability to have a good relationship with you, with the United States. And therefore, we're going to try to get this done. So essentially, you first convince them that the relationship is important. And by the way, to do that, you kind of have to swallow on a couple of things and pick your battles and not blast. If you're a tiny country like Macedonia, there are more than a tiny number of things that you can complain about. So you're careful with that, but what you are clear about is the degree to which the United States cares about Macedonia. And when people feel that, they're prepared to do things because they know the relationship is important. It's all, and by the way, diplomacy is no different from one's personal life. When you're dealing with somebody, you try to understand where they're coming from on an issue. And, for Americans, we've been so blessed to live in this country and to be far away from some of these terrible issues. And you ought to stop to think, how would I do if I were that
Yeah.
prime minister of Macedonia, let's say? How would I handle that issue? And so you just develop a little empathy, a little understanding of where the other person is coming from. And then, read a few history books and you'll be ready to be a diplomat.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I think that's important, both the empathy question and also understanding that every country has domestic politics, and political leaders have constituencies, and understanding how to navigate those are quite important.
Weirdly, even brutal dictatorships can have.
Yes, even brutal dictatorships have domestic politics.
And
So
again, the issue isn't to knuckle under to this stuff. The issue is to understand it.
yes,
And I think, as any negotiator does, you try to take something that is more valuable to the other guy than it is to you. And then you try to take something that is more valuable to yourself than to the other guy, and see if through this process of policy arbitrage, if you will, you can find ways to make progress, because neither side feels they're giving up a lot, but each side feels they're getting a lot.
that they're getting. Yeah.
If you can figure out the relative value of stuff, and the only way to do that is to listen hard and kind of get a sense of what they really care about. I'll tell you, though, dealing with the North Koreans, you think they'd want something, you'd go and move heaven and earth for it, and then they wanted it until they didn't want it.
Until they didn't want it. Yeah.
So they can be a real challenge, especially on this nuclear question.
Yeah.
Which I used to tell them, I said, we got a lot of options for dealing with that. That was diplomatese as a threat.
Yeah.
I said, we have a lot of options. We don't have the option of walking away. We're not going to walk away from this. And we're not going to accept you as a nuclear state. And I think some points that you want to make, you better be willing to make them 50 times. I mean, advertisers do it all the time. You don't just see one beer ad. That wouldn't make you want to drink beer. You'd see another 49 beer ads, maybe I'll try it.
Maybe I'll try it.
And I think in diplomacy, you have to keep emphasizing and repeating yourself. And because that's the way you establish a kind of level of effort. This is important to me. Okay, got it?